gosh, Wyndham, I forget that there's a real audience. How very exciting. I only wish I could be with you in a mask-free, wonderful location. Unfortunately, I'm not. I'm still in the middle of my old constituency in Wiltshire. But a great privilege and a pleasure not only to follow that extraordinary call to arms from His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, but also to be participating in this second Guernsey Sustainable Finance Week. And what an opportunity to be talking with an audience representing one of the truly leading global funds jurisdictions, both in assets under management, but also in terms of sustainability leadership, and of course the focus on private equity and the wealth space. And this is going to be a fantastic opportunity over the next few days for us to share information and best practice. And I'm very much looking forward to hearing from the experts who will be on the panels I'll be chairing this afternoon. But it's also a very poignant moment for me, as Barnaby mentioned in his introduction. I'm here doing the keynote speech because we have lost one of the truly great men of the sustainable finance space, Sir Roger Gifford, who was a friend who I worked with very closely. I set up the Green Finance Task Force and asked him to chair it, and that led us to the government of funding the Green Finance Institute. And Sir Roger, in his over 50 years of experience in a very rapidly changing global financial space, dealt with these extraordinary challenges of Big Bang, deregulation, 2008 crisis, the rise of sustainable finance with intelligence, wisdom, kindness, and open-mindedness. And his passing, I think, is a great loss to all of us, especially those who had the privilege of working with him. But in preparing for the speech, it allowed me to do something that led me to rack my memory banks of time working with him, but also to go back and look at some of his more recent speeches on the topic of the opportunity and the challenge of green finance. And indeed, his last speech publicly available on this was only less than a month ago, 2 weeks before he passed away. And it was so striking how his views were as eloquent and passionate and well thought out as ever. So I thought it would be both useful and respectful to draw on some of the views I've heard him express over the years as to frame some of the remarks I'd like to make today. And I'm going to do that around 5 things that Roger said on repeated occasions. The first was to start with the positive. The second, that collaboration is key. The third, that targets are great. What really matters is near-term, deliverable, practical action. Fourthly, he was obsessed with the just transition. What did all of these things mean for people, as we heard the Prince of Wales also so eloquently reference? And fifthly, Roger liked to be described as ruthlessly practical in all that he did. So let me start with the positive. And, you know, sometimes on days like today, although the sun is shining and some of you are able to meet in person, if you look at the data, and if you've been in the climate space for a while, as I have, it's quite difficult to be positive. The global levels of greenhouse gas, or CO2 now, are the highest we think they've been for 4.5 million years. 4.5 million years, of which we as a settled human species with an agrarian agricultural system have been essentially doing that for about 5,000. So we're in pretty uncharted historical territory for our species. And, you know, last time those CO2 levels were this high, records suggest, fossil records, that sea levels were 20 meters higher, that the global temperatures were on average 3 to 4 degrees centigrade higher, and there were beech forests growing on the South Pole. And, you know, what was very striking about the COVID slowdown, that's led us all to be relying on these virtual platforms, is it didn't register a blip on these daily tracking of the CO2 levels tracked at a great institute in Hawaii and producing a thing called the Keeling curve. Not a blip. So all of those not traveling, changing our commuting patterns, changing in some ways our consumption patterns, although I may well get interrupted with a ring on the doorbell, which is Amazon delivering yet another package I'd forgotten I'd ordered. We continue to shop even during lockdown. But our enormous, unprecedented change of life last year has not registered. And indeed, humanity has increased its contribution of the most important greenhouse gases by 50% since the start of the Industrial Revolution. And of course, one of the other challenges with those who want to focus on the positive is if you look at the COP process, where I served as president designate and brought the COP to Glasgow, some say that these multilateral institutions are finding it very difficult to provide the call to arms and the action that we need. But let's focus on the positive in honour of Sir Roger. Last time emissions in the UK were this low, Queen Victoria was on the throne. We have made in this country extraordinary progress in cutting our greenhouse gas emissions since 1990. Sustainability, as the Prince of Wales referred to, is going mainstream. It's like a boulder rolling downhill, unstoppable momentum now. And every conversation in boardrooms, with investment committees, with credit committees, with lenders and investors will start, I think, these days with a conversation about sustainability. And while some issues around the UN protocol remain, we've just seen what people are referring to as the magnificent G7, some pretty strong indications that the G7 this year will really be trying to play a part again in helping frame some of these major decisions, of course, on minimum global taxation levels, but also on mandatory climate reporting, conversations about commitments to climate finance globally. And of course, this coalition of the willing working together could do so much more going forward. And so we've moved from a sort of wacky environmentalist fringe, as some of us were described in our past, to sustainability now being front and centre of the conversation about capitalism going forward. And that, I think, gives us extraordinary momentum and opportunities and a chance to really take this forward in a positive way. But the second lesson was collaboration is key. And, Roger was absolutely right in this. When we look at the need for collaboration, whether it's between the public and private sectors, as we've seen expressed so well in the Green Finance Institute, whether it's across sectors coming together to come up with voluntary measurement targets or lobby for changes with government. Indeed, the financial sector, I think, based on the experiences in 2008, has shown extraordinary global collaboration, both at the central bank and regulatory levels, and also taken down to risk capital allocation and decisions made with individual institutions. And I think that sense, at the heart of this process is a desire to collaborate, to measure, to share data so we can manage the problem. And one of the challenges in the climate space is, what is this collaboration vehicle? We've talked about COP and the UNFCCC process. We've talked about the G7, but remember the G7 accounts for only 50% or so of GDP and 27% of global emissions. It's making some great progress, but clearly it's not enough. The great moves that have happened with central banks moving as one and financial regulators to really build stability in the financial system are a hugely powerful and impactful example of what we can do. And basically, when I think about carbon, I think the real challenge is, just as we set up a cash accounting system that grew from a few accountants in Scotland wanting to report on a collective basis, we're now in the process of creating a carbon accounting system, translating emissions into numbers where we can make sense of them. And of course, when you can measure something, you can assess the risk and manage it, and also manage the returns. And I think this enormous power of the financial sector collaboration is an immense opportunity. Thirdly, targets are great. We love targets, but we really like near-term practical deliverable action. And always the question when you see these wonderful race to zero targets or the race to resilience targets, fantastic momentum there. But what's the how of that? How are you going to deliver it? What's going to be the mechanism? How will you report? How will you tell us what your emissions are, not just in 2050, but next year? And what's your proportion of reduction of CO2 versus removal of CO2? And, I'm going to say something a little bit rude about my former profession as a politician. And this does not apply to any of my former cabinet colleagues specifically, but words are quite cheap for politicians, particularly when you have weak enforcement mechanisms. And we do have very weak enforcement mechanisms in the climate space. And so I discount quite a lot of the net zero pledges being brought forward by today's generation of politicians, because the average tenure of a country leader is 4 years. It's easy to pledge something knowing you're not going to be around for anything like the time to see it delivered. CEOs, by the way, average tenure of 8 years, so a little more skin in the game for the private sector. but what are the ways to hold participants to account, to make sure that these actions that are delivered are specific and practical? And again, I come back to the role of the financial sector. I spent many years in finance in the UK and in New York, and the practical, the deliverable, what are the numbers, what's the returns, what does this do to the cost of capital, how do we share the data to come up with a shared understanding of risk and return, something that this sector is incredibly good at doing. Perhaps the sector not historically so good at doing the fourth lesson, according to Roger, which is how do you make this transition just? How do you make it work for the people who are involved? And when you think about something as local as retrofitting housing stock, something that the Green Finance Institute is doing some great work on, it is not the fault of the current generation that the houses they often live in were badly built 150 years ago, or indeed planning rules have changed since then and not in a way that benefits their homes, or indeed that there hasn't been a huge investment programme over the last 30 years. And I saw myself as the minister responsible for bringing in the energy price cap that we collectively had put some policy costs onto consumer bills in the name of the transition that were unfairly borne by those who were least able to pay. And I don't think we had ever really thought that through, and we had to go in and then cap prices as a result. If you talk about coal, a sector that is absolutely in the frame now. If the world can agree on one thing, it's the need to make coal history. But coal phase out, as some of us will remember in the UK, was a highly charged, difficult political problem, done in a pretty brutal way, I have to say, back in the 80s. And yet these challenges remain. Coal miners may not be a powerful economic force, but they are a strong political force. And there are huge challenges associated with this transition for particular sectors. And lastly, if you think globally, it is sadly the case that the costs of action on climate mitigation and adaptation and the impact fall disproportionately on those least able to bear it. Countries that are desertifying, that don't have infrastructure investment, or with marginalised people with few land rights or legal systems that we would recognise. And so how to make this transition just has to be at the heart of all of these conversations. And then the final point, let's be ruthlessly practical about this. Roger and I had many a conversation about the challenge we face, which is somehow in the world of sustainability, we make the perfect the enemy of the good. We argue endlessly about what is the right proportion of emissions a sector should be allowed to reduce before it's allowed to actually offset. We fight like cats in a sack in the global kind of COP debates about which countries should go first and what are the common but differentiated responsibilities that underpin these challenges. And the truth of the matter is it's not a question of either or, it's both and. Any levers we can pull, we should be pulling hard now, because while we argue the CO2 levels inexorably climb. And so the question I think that we should be thinking every day is, what do we do now? What do we do that we know makes a demonstrable change? How do we find ruthlessly practical solutions, even if sometimes the PR around them is not particularly sexy? And I'm thinking particularly of some of the fossil fuel transitions, which are fraught with difficulty now. And yet if you speak to energy ministers in some of the developing world, they say, so you're telling me that my auntie can't buy a car and she has to have a 5-hour bus trip these days to get to work until she can afford a Tesla and until there's a renewable grid. What planet are you on? And I think these are questions that all too often we spend a lot of time intellectually debating rather than focusing on the ruthlessly practical. And Roger was also a great one for focusing on the facts and investing in the knowledge. He had a great passion for science and for data. And one of my most memorable sort of co-team efforts with him was trying to persuade the UK Treasury to issue a sovereign green bond. And we went in armed with data about how these bonds were so appealing to investors and they would price so well off the curve. And this was terribly exciting politically. And we got a bit of a no, actually quite a strong no, from the debt office and also from the then Chancellor. Shame on you, Philip Hammond, a good friend of mine. And then, so now we see see that the UK government has changed its mind and is going to issue a sovereign green bond. Fantastic in this year of COP hosting. 15 billion, a drop in the ocean compared to the 300 billion of borrowing that we know we need. But what another great move forward for this ruthlessly pragmatic set of arguments. And I think it would be a wonderful legacy if we named this particular issue the Gifford guilt. And of course, Roger brought nothing but practical solutions in his work at the Green Finance Institute, and also talked always about the opportunity that's there. And let me spend the last minute just ending with the positive. Roger had this 150-year career in so many parts of the financial system, and I've had a slightly shorter career than him at nowhere near such an elevated level. But I think all of us involved in this system have seen this relentless, unstoppable momentum for change, new markets, new regulation, new products, this extraordinary opportunity, 12 trillion dollars investment required to green the energy system expected over the next 30 years, new insurance products being developed all the time, trading now in carbon offsets starting to expand extraordinarily powerfully, new demands for ESG investment, which I know you'll be seeing in the fund community, and then the whole ecosystem of finance, legal, communications advice that goes around this extraordinary opportunity. So there is a massive momentum and huge opportunity developing for all participants in this market, including those in Guernsey, including those in the UK and wonderful Guernsey and other Crown dependencies. Accelerating momentum, enormous opportunity. And my only regret, if I have one regret, is that Sir Roger could not be with us to see the process that he participated in so passionately develop and evolve in the future. Thank you very much.